welcome, and we really thank you for sharing your time with us. So my name is Mumbi Kanyogo, and I'm one of the researchers on this project, along with Bobina Zulfa and Irene Mwendwa, who will we'll start us off by situating us and giving us a project overview. But before we move on to Irene, I will just start by just going over our agenda for today. After Irene gives us a project overview, Bobina and I will give a very brief overview of our report and research findings. This is just a short introduction. You can engage with a longer version, more detailed version of the report online. We'll be sharing copies after this webinar, and then we will get into a panel discussion, which will be moderated by Bobina, and our speakers, who are wonderful collaborators of ours, will be Timothy Were, who is the Director of ICT in the State Department for Trade, and then Miriam Beatrice Wanjiro, who is the Programs Officer at Paradigm Initiative, and then Caleb Ndaka, who is a co-founder of Kids Camp. And then after that, we'll have a brief Q&A session, and then Harriet Washira, who will be representing the Open Government Partnership Secretariat, will speak more about what OGP does and how you can all engage with it. And then Irene will close us out by 5 p.m. So Irene, the floor is yours to situate us and give us an overview of the project.
Thank you, Habaria Gioni. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us. I can see the numbers and everyone trickling in, and I hope those who join are able to follow. And we want to first and foremost say thank you, because in the midst of everything that's happening right now, especially in the tech community, in the data governance community, very much influenced by United States government, we are seeing resilience. We are seeing communities still continuing with their wonderful work to engage different individuals and also stakeholders in this work. So just to say, we are very, very honored that we are also able to launch this project at this time and the final products. And we hope that you will be able to interact with them even in the midst of everything that's happening. We embarked on this work a little earlier than the day we started. We started the program or the project in September of 2023, but we had begun conversations with the Open Government Partnerships for a while, really, because they wanted to understand, as a data-centric and a very data-facing membership organization, how they can really harness data and data governance and digital governance all together to ensure that there is better public service delivery, and the OGP principles are also being applied to its different country members and civil society members. And in the midst of all that, the Open Government Partnership had its annual meeting in Tallinn, Estonia, where also the Kenya government was able to launch some of its progress in terms of organizing. And immediately when our elections had passed, this is October of 2022, entering 2023, sharing really how the government of Kenya was digitizing over 5,000 government services. This is moving them from, a lot of paper, moving some of the services from queue-based to you can have them at the palm of your hands using your phone, using your analog phone if you use your SSD, and also for those of us who are Kenyans using the eCitizen platform, which has now embarked and expanded to add a grand or more scope or more government services. So in the midst of all this, then the OGP Secretariat and policy got to together to try and understand in all this how our community is being engaged and how are the principles of the Open Government Partnership being employed or applied, because these are against ensuring that you work with everyone involved. And in this case, governance-wise, the Kenya government working and engaging its citizens to ensure that the digitizing and advancing collaborations and engaging tech communities and private tech companies who are building and supporting in some of these processes are also listening to what's happening in terms of the usage and the users really engaging in this process. So immediately we got into the project and started in September 2023. I'm just sharing some timelines so that we can all situate how this has come a long way. It's not just come immediately. It's really been a process where we were really against the National Action Plan by the OGP Kenya Secretariat and the Kenya civil society clusters. And in all this, supporting the government strategic pillars on advancing digital governance in Kenya, which there are few legislation, policies, and fact sheets and guidance notes shared by different authorities, say the ICT authority, the communication authority, but in the wake of digitizing more government services for public service delivery, then it meant there needs to be more nuanced approaches in looking at some of the processes that we embark on. And we'll be hearing from some of the government representatives who are going to join us about some of the processes and how they've improved. So we were able to work with the Civil Society Kenya clusters of the OGP, the Open Government Partnership, during membership meetings, during training sessions, and during fact-finding sessions, and also information sharing sessions where the Kenya Civil Society cluster was able to receive advice and information from the Kenya government about the advancements they've made. And this is how the Kenya OGP National Action Plan, for instance, came about, which strongly underpins some of the digital governance pillars that the OGP CSO clusters had also placed. So policy, again, advanced this research with engaging over, just considering the pre-engagements of this project, we have now engaged over 100 people who are varying from different areas, which is the tech community, the government, civil society representatives, startups, civic tech organizations, civil society organizations, who said, there is really an importance for aligning and to understand what the Kenya government is doing and if it's really working with its communities. So in these information sharing sessions, for instance, in Nairobi, Kenya, there was a time when we were speaking about artificial intelligence and how Kenya will embark on artificial intelligence governance. What's the trade-off? Are we going to take up a strategy? Are we going to take up an act of parliament? Are we going to take up, for instance, progress that's going to advance maybe the tech community to build more AI tools, or to really ensure AI tools are really born and bred in Kenya? There is an instance where through the OGP civil society cluster, we were also listening to how digital tools and social media tools were being used to advance conversations on what was happening in parliament. And without emphasizing, the period of June, the period of around March to around November of 2024 in Kenya was really marked with a lot of engagement online, which also led to development of private, or I could say public-based or civic tech tools that were really also advancing digital governance in other sectors, such as the conversation of the finance bill in Kenya, the conversation on digital health bill, and the conversations on taxation, which have also led to a lot of advancements in terms of business amendment bills, which we are seeing in Parliament and the Senate level today, which advanced because people were engaging and collectivizing and using digital tools to really engage. At the same time, as we were embarking on the project, we also were able to see how tech companies, which are born and bred in Kenya, were also engaged in this process to harness the power of people of Kenya engaging. This is availability of data, availability of the internet, availability of connectivity, even to the last mile, because this was part of the process that was immediately advanced by the Ministry of ICT when we had our new president. So with those considerations, there are so many things that Kenya has undergone, experienced in a very organic way, which leads policies, findings into, Kenya's digitizing process can also be something that other African countries can look up to, but notwithstanding, there are some very key lessons that can ensure that citizens work with governments from day one, and inbred or technology companies and database companies based in our countries can also advance the best wishes or the best use scenarios or use cases for our citizens. So with that, I'll leave you all maybe with a question to think about. Do you or are you experiencing difficulties in engaging in your programs or in your work out of some of the US or United States government decisions that we have seen? Please tell us in the chat how this you foresee this may also advance or interrupt digital governance conversations in Kenya. Thank you very much. Over to you, Mumbi.
Thank you so much, Irene, for making the connection between the present moment that we're in and the research that we've been conducting over the last 1.5 years. I think those insights and those connections will be built on in the panel. But before we get there, Bobina and I will just give you a short introduction to our findings from the research that we conducted. So Bobina will start us off by giving us a theoretical sort of grounding.
All right. Thank you, Irene. Thank you, Mumbi. All right. I will. So the study objectives, as Irene has sort of given this broader landscape, we came in, from the perspective of just what the OGP was trying to put across with its expression in the National Action Plan, on, the need to bridge these gaps and, addressing the exclusion in digital service delivery. And so we came in from that perspective. And I think that framing within that digital commitment helped us, first of all, understand that Kenya is still grappling very much with challenges to do with inclusive digital governance. So I think we come in, first of all, from a place of there isn't a shared understanding of what exactly inclusive digital governance is. I think, especially within the policy making space, we often hear what should be done, which is inclusion within, for example, the digital governance realm, but we're not told how to do it, which was very special, I think, about this research. We tried to work around how to actually do this. And so the study objectives are very, they're oriented, the knowledge production is very much oriented towards how the practice of inclusion is being done within the digital governance space. And so the study objectives from that perspective then were, one, to understand how digital governance and inclusive digital governance are understood by digital governance commitment cluster and ecosystem actors. Again, just as a reminder, Irene has sort of drawn the broader picture. For the study, we was particularly speaking to persons within the OGP. So we have the partnership is made of some members from civil society, some members from government, private sector, and etc. And so it was to understand how these people understand. One was to understand how do these different actors understand digital governance. Two was to explore and determine the processes and mechanisms through which inclusive digital governance is realized. Again, back to the idea of practice, how it is done. And lastly, to situate the use of gender data across Kenya's broader approach to inclusive digital governance. And I think, again, this speaks to sort of some of the things Irene pointed on evidence-based decision-making, and particularly when it comes to inclusion, how the gender data aspect plays into all of that. Okay, so I'll give just a little sort of scene setting before Mumbi gets into the findings of just what the theoretical underpinnings of this in terms of what are the global debates on digital governance, right? How are these different issues understood within the broader digital governance ecosystem everywhere else? And so try that sort of understanding, that underpinning is what guided how we got into the research, the investigation, the way it was carried out, the questions we asked, and our thinking broadly around the different issues we were investigating. Okay, so I think first, and I'll just touch on a few of these things again because the report is extensive, and urge you very much to have a read after this because we're launching it right after it's open for reading. But I'll just touch on some of the things I think that very much could guide some of our discussion today. One is digital governance and how it is understood across in different parts of the world, right? I think the very first thing is that we see that the way digital governance is understood is fundamentally it's understood differently in different contexts. So we have digital governance and digital government, and these are periodically used interchangeably. But the problem is that we often find that the idea of digital government, which is just a subset of one, which is digital governance, I'm going to get to how that is a subset, is often, so we find that broadly, the entire idea of digital governance is largely reduced to a technical question, yet it is really largely a political question. So how is that? Digital governance broadly speaks to, the creation and maintenance of digital affordances that should enable citizens to communicate with their government, right? To participate in decision-making and communicate with each other. So that is one part of digital governance. The other being, and I think this comes from the UNDP framing, the governance of digitization as a process, right? So as you're digitizing, how do you ensure that this process is rights-based, it's inclusive, it supports the achievement of SDGs and so on. So within that broader landscape of digital governance, the digital government aspect of integrating ICTs, a government integrating ICTs in how they get to communicate with different stakeholders or operate with different stakeholders, be it government to citizens or to businesses or etc. different stakeholders. That framing, which sort of reduces this broader aspect, which includes so many different things, that is more than just a technical there's more than just a technical issue, is one of the things that we see in terms of how implementation plays out in Kenya and across so many other jurisdictions, but particularly for this study because we're looking at Kenya. So then I think the other thing that's in that, trying to understand the distinctions in digital governance, digital government, is in the outcomes as well, the expected outcomes of the two different sort of definitions. So because with digital government, for example, the aim is really the improvement of the efficiency of state service delivery, right? With digital service delivery, we're looking at how to modernize and make more efficient, and speed and precision and all these things. But with the expected outcome of digital governance is broader. We see, how do you have an interactive system wherein, you have citizens being able to engage in informing policy making within this space, and also governments are able to access more data, which they can use to respond to citizen concerns. So that was sort of like the very first beginning, and in just how are these issues understood, and there is of course so much more within that, and you'll find it in the report, the aspects of digital governance and digital government, and it also goes to, there is a bit of e-government, right, and e-democracy, and I'll get to that. Okay, so then down to inclusive digital digital governance. You find now that there is a lot of criticism in just the literature globally, that in just different parts of the world, that with this extensive landscape of what makes digital governance, you find that there is a prioritization of just certain aspects of it, right? So for instance, we've said that digital governance makes up all these issues to do with digital service delivery and the digital facilitation of citizen participation, transparency, accountability, etc. However, in practice, and I think we found that this is within very much within the broader African continent, but also particularly for Kenya, is that there is almost this like very vigorous pursuit of digital service delivery, right? The digital government idea seems to take precedence. And so there is issues to do with inequality and democracy, particularly e-democracy here are sidelined, right? So precision and speed and modernity, all these are put over how citizens, are afforded access to these services, right? So issues to do with inequality and democracy, etc., seem to be marginalized. And particularly for Kenya, I think something we also found interesting in the study is there seems to be the ideological sort of buttressing of Kenya's digitization approach seems to be digital for development, right? Which is, again, not very surprising because, again, this is very similar for most of Africa as well. But this approach, again, very much centers these visions of modernity and etc. And again, this deduction was sort of made from just looking at the core policy and legal frameworks of the country, right? You look at the Kenya National Digital Master Plan, or the e-government strategy, or the National ICT policy, etc. You see how all of them very much speak to very strongly to the digital for development. And it's not to say that the issues to do with inclusion, right, affording access to people in their different capacities isn't spoken to. It is, but more minimally than the idea of digital government. Okay, and then of course the idea of digital divides is very central to the entire conversation of inclusive digital governance, because, and I think very interesting here is the fact that, and again to where I started on just the idea of policy research, right? I'm talking about not the company policy, but policy making, right? Is that it has to be, the contextualizing and being very close to the issues, the realities of people. You find, I think, often in this space, right, conversations have in many ways wanted to move away from the conversation on digital divides, but it's almost not a possibility, because the realities are these are issues we're still grappling with, right? So with the digital divide issues, I mean, so many people, of course, broadly understand this, but we get into it and try to make the connections to digital governance, and how it becomes one of the biggest barriers to inclusive digital governance. So we see, for instance, we have two ways it plays out. You have a coverage gap, you have a usage gap. With a coverage gap, for instance, you have, for instance, I think we have an example in the report where there's a GSMA report that speaks to, I think between 2017 and I don't know to 2022, we have 3G coverage in Africa being pushed, I think, from 65 to about 85%. But that is coverage that is being pushed. However, when it comes to usage, how many people actually have access to the internet to be able to use, to get access to this infrastructure that is being pushed out more? And so the digital divide conversation, especially from the usage angle, becomes very critical to this entire conversation. And I guess then lastly is then e-democracy. I had touched on this a bit, but again, this is a very critical aspect of the broader inclusive digital governance conversation, because and I think first what we found is that you find that there is, this wealth of literature, right, making a case for, the usefulness or the importance of, integrating ICTs in Kenya's, public sector. However, what is much less talked about is the idea of trying to understand the impact of the reforms brought about by digitization towards the enhancement of democratic processes. And that is very, very critical, because again, speaking to the broader understanding of what digital governance is, this digital affordance is allowing government to interact with the citizens having the space to be able to inform decision making, right? So e-democracy becomes a very critical aspect of inclusive digital governance, because it's almost moot to just have one-way channels where you're just bringing down services on people that maybe they don't fully, again, to the idea of citizen centricity that again we speak to very broadly, is if citizens are not engaging with the systems you're putting in place for different reasons, given their different realities or their different needs, then not integrating the very idea of we have these systems, these digital affordances that could allow us as government to communicate with our citizenry, to be more responsive to them, because we have this two-way channel with them. It negates the very idea of inclusion, right, and citizen centricity. So that's a bit of the theoretical underpinning that led to sort of the sections that we get into with, looking at emerging technologies and algorithmic accountability and decision making, and a bit of gender data and how that sort of plays within the broader landscape of informing digital governance. And again, public participation is a very big one when it comes to, again, the citizen to state interaction, designing these policies or interventions within the digital governance landscape. I'll leave Mumbi to take it on from here with the findings. Thank you.
Thank you, Bobina. I think I'll be building on a lot of what you introduced, because a lot of what we saw being brought up, especially in sort of what I'll call like the critical digital governance literature, were also critiques that were sort of amplified by people within the civil society. And then also a really critical sort of framing for our study was the fact that government is not a monolith. So whereas the Ministry of ICT will have a particular approach, the Ministry of Agriculture will have a different one. So even then we saw sort of critical readings of digital governance in Kenya from people who are actually within government, as well as interesting solutions to challenges that we saw in other sort of line ministries. So what I'm going to share now is sort of 5 findings or 5 highlights that we have from our research. Again, as Bobina mentioned, we're launching our report after this session. So if you want to take a deeper dive, please do read the report. So Bobina touched on the fact that there was a lot of ideological dissonance that we found within our study about how people even conceive of digital governance. There's people who think of it prioritizing this coverage gap, and then there's also people who prioritize and are thinking more expansively about inclusive digital governance and really thinking about usage. And so what we were seeing is a very interesting, clear divide. So we found that civil society and line ministries, which are not in charge of coordination. So when I say line ministries that are not in charge of coordination, I'm talking about ministries and entities that are not necessarily attached to the Ministry of ICT. So what we saw with those particular entities is they're thinking about inclusive digital governance at the level of the coverage gap, but also the usage gap. So the questions that they were bringing up when we're thinking about inclusive digital governance is questions not just about the digital divide, but nuancing even and expanding that question of the digital divide to even think about accessibility. When someone has a phone, are they even able to actually use the technologies that they need in order to access service delivery? Even when they have, when the government has data, for example, are they able to actually use it in order to make service delivery more citizen-centric? So these are the questions that people were raising within CSOs and other line ministries. But then what we saw with the Ministry of ICT, the ICT Authority, and all the other entities therein that are housed under this particular line ministry was a narrower vision of digital governance, inclusive digital governance, that was focused on closing the coverage gap. So there's a lot of emphasis on last mile projects and a lot of emphasis on expanding the actual sort of the power of the connectivity that we actually have, but there's less attention to this idea of data interoperability, data integration, and then even more simpler ideas around accessibility. So things like language, things like actual skill, technical skill to be able to actually access online digital services. So we were seeing that particular gap. And on its surface, what that might appear is that there's a diversity of opinions about what inclusive digital governance means. So it might seem like a pretty benign difference. But what we saw when we actually started talking to some line ministries is that because of this difference and dissonance in visions, the challenge actually shows up at the point of coordination and at the point of drawing connections and ensuring collaboration between line ministries, which is a duty that is supposed to be taken up by the Ministry of ICT and Digital Economy. And so because of that, I'll just give an example. For example, the Ministry of Livestock and Agricultural Development is really interested in thinking about inclusive digital governance at the level of data integration and interoperability. So they're really interested in actually combining data sets by different actors within the agricultural sector in order to shape the ministry's decision-making and ensure that it's actually responding to farmers' needs. But they constantly hit on challenges and buffers because there are no overarching data governance frameworks that allow exchange even within government. So even so we're seeing that this ideological difference and this dissonance not only is not just an ideological difference, it's not something benign, that actually has consequences for implementation and decision making down the line. And so what we're seeing is that there's a lot of visionaries within government who are not able to actually implement a more expansive view of inclusive digital governance because of the lack of overall coordination at the national level. And then now getting into the issue of gender data, one thing that we found was that, again, this idea of conflicting definitions of gender data. For us, a really big theme throughout this research is the fact that ideological differences are political and they determine what kinds of what kind of projects and what kinds of interventions within inclusive digital governance are actually pursued. So when it comes to gender data, what we were seeing is that, of course, while civil society has a sort of broader idea of gender data and thinking about how that data can be used in order to really probe the way in which the way that digital governance is structured can often marginalize people who are women, people who have disabilities, people who are in rural areas within Kenya. While they were thinking about gender data at that level and thinking about how those questions can actually shape decision making, what we see in the mainstream is that the definition of gender data is again very narrow, and it's very limited to this idea of sex disaggregated data. And the consequence of this is that the way that sex disaggregated data is used, because it's not thought of as a tool for decision making, instead as a tool for implementing already made policies. What this means is that government is not actually using and asking questions at the point of design that would allow them to actually develop digital governance policies that actually make sense for marginalized groups. So what does it mean, for example, that when you go for sensitization meetings or desensitization or validation meetings within rural areas, within marginalized areas, you do it at the time when women are supposed to be overseeing sort of care duties, taking care of the children, taking care of the household, washing clothes, getting children ready for homework, etc. What does it mean that we're not actually thinking about the times when we're actually training people in order to use these digital technologies? These are the questions that would shape the design of a policy, but instead, the way that gender data is actually used is to then think about there's this many women in a particular community, there's this many men in a particular community, and that's the end of the story. There's not a question about how we can actually use that information in order to expand who has access to digital service delivery. And then another aspect related to gender data that we found was, I think in a lot of different spaces, we've been talking about the impact of anti-feminist backlash. And the way that is shaping how people interact with each other, and also resulting in sort of backsliding on feminist and gender justice gains. As Irene mentioned, we're seeing it in terms of the global gag rule, for example, and in SRHR spaces, but we're also seeing it in the digital governance space. I think what people or organizations often focus on when they're thinking about capacity building around gender data is this issue of the technical aspect. What does it mean to what does it look like to disaggregate data, for example, at a gender level? And then what does it mean to actually, like the case that we're making, to actually include it at a policy level? But there's a step that needs to happen before that, because what we're seeing is that there's a lot of hostility to even the question of gender as a relevant question within digital governance. And we're seeing some myths and dominant narratives that are even precluding or making people hesitant to even engage within this conversation about the importance of gender data within digital governance. So some myths that we found when we were collecting the data is this idea that data is neutral. So already from the get-go, this means that you're never looking at data within a critical eye, and you're never asking questions that might be relevant to marginalized groups, but might not be at all relevant to people who have more power within society. And then a second narrative that we found is this idea that women are over-empowered. And so why would we continue to implement these gender mainstreaming policies, including collecting gender data? And what this means is that there's resistance to the integration of gender data in Kenya's data ecosystems by the very decision makers who would be able to mandate that officers actually collect this data. So if those people are not on our side, what are the impacts or the consequences of that for the sort of downstream training that we're doing of officers in order to increase their capacity to be able to collect this data? It means that it completely invalidates that type of training. We need to really think about shifting the narrative around gender data and gender equality more broadly. The other thing that came up again, similarly, is this idea of coordination and lack of understanding of who has the mandate for actually mainstreaming gender data within different government entities. So there's a lack of clarity about who should be overseeing this process, which means that it ends up being sidelined by a lot of entities that actually should be engaging in the process. I have 2 more findings to share. So in terms of AI and sort of integrating artificial intelligence into digital service delivery, what we found in Kenya is that there's 2 overarching approaches at the moment. So first of all, there's this idea of using AI for service delivery. So we're seeing this integration by different parts of government. So there are some which are more advanced in this process than others. So we're seeing the use of chatbots, facial recognition technologies, digital identification. And then the other side of this is also the governance and regulation of AI systems by private sector. The challenge and gap that we're seeing is this question of vision. The fact that, so for example, a really central to this debate has been the idea that the global south are simply consumers of AI technologies which are produced in the global north. And Kenya has not been sort of an outlier in this discussion. There are a lot of data workers who are mostly concerned with the work of data labeling, data cleaning, and that seems to be an area that the government is keen on growing. But one question that a lot of civil society brought up is, what does it mean for Kenya to actually create a vision of AI that actually generates opportunities, meaningful opportunities for young people, and doesn't necessarily relegate them to sorting out sort of like the data dustbin of the West. So this is a question that came up a lot. What does it mean for us to develop a vision and a strategy that subverts this extractive and exploitative model that seems to be what government is most comfortable with at the moment? And then lastly was the question of public participation as it relates to digital governance. So one thing that Bobina and I picked up as a critical discussion, even within the OGP sort of convenings and OGP shared spaces, is this assumption that the general public, so I'm not talking about civil society, civ tech, I'm talking about the general public, people who are the ones who are most likely to actually interact with digital service delivery, because ultimately they're the ones who interact most with state services. And so they're the ones who, citizens are often the ones who are going to deal with the consequences of the digitization of their services, but are the least involved in the decision-making processes. But there's a belief that generally what's required in order to engage within public participation spaces related to digital governance is that you need technical expertise. So lack of expertise, technical expertise, immediately disqualifies you from being able to actually participate in these spaces. And this was a belief that was not only shared by people who are within government, but also within civil society and the private sector. And it was actually very interesting to talk to someone who was in the Ministry of Livestock and Agriculture, who spoke about the importance of reframing how we speak about digital governance, because oftentimes, and what's reflected and this is a reflection of how digital governance is coordinated in the mainstream, it's seen as something that is separate from more sort of present state services, healthcare, agriculture, education. But what he was arguing for and making the case for is that civil servants and civil society need to reframe how we speak about digital governance and make the connections for citizens about how those tools can actually enhance or have consequences for their access to digital service delivery. So there's a lot of work that we need to do in order to make the conversation accessible instead of increasing the threshold for who gets to actually participate in the conversations. So I'll stop there and then hand over to Bobina to moderate the panel. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mumbi. There was a little overview of the findings and just what the report sort of goes over. So we have a panel discussion with Mumbi had introduced the panelists at the start of the webinar, but I'll do that again just for the people who are joining. So we're going to have a roundtable type discussion with three of our speakers joining us today. The first being Timothy Were, who is Director of ICT, State Department of Trade. Then we're also being joined by Miriam Beatrice Wanjiru, who is the Programs Officer at Paradigm Initiative, and Caleb Ndaka, who is co-founder Kidscom Camp. Okay, so we're looking to just have a discussion that's contextualizing some of our findings and just this broader overview that we've given to what's been happening in the recent past, what do we foresee coming up and etc., but really around the design and the implementation and the sustainability as well of the digital governance ecosystem as we're thinking around it, particularly when it comes to policy making. So get right into it. I think my first question goes to, since it's a roundtable, I will open it up to all the speakers. So we can just go over the question. I guess we could go, whichever order. So the first question is, we want to go over, we've talked a little bit about, Mumbi has been going over the findings. So with the state of play of digital governance in Kenya as it is today, what would you say is, progress that has been made in strengthening Kenya's digital governance approach over the last 3 years? I'll open up the floor to Miriam or Timothy or Caleb.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. My name is Miriam Beatrice Wanjiru. As has been introduced, I work with Paradigm Initiative as the Programs Officer for East Africa. It's a bit difficult to try and say progress because a lot of people know me as the person who says what is not working. And first of all, congratulations to Policy for putting together this report. What is the status of digital governance? And I absolutely love the sort of like definition that you give, an academic definition to just explain what digital governance is. I remember when you're putting together the findings, a lot of us were grappling between, is it just the technical aspect of it or the policy angle? But both fit into digital governance in that it is both systems and channels that allow citizens to participate in public policy making and decision making, but then it is also the concept around the governance in and of itself of what we like to call digitization in Kenya. So looking at those two explanations, I would say that we've seen, again, what the report is calling a mass adoption of services, public services to e-governance. If I remember correctly, I think sometime in 2022, 2023, we only had about 4,000 services online, but currently we have over 16 services online through different platforms such as eCitizen. And that is something that we have been seeing over the years. I anticipate and I expect these services will be more. Is it a good thing? Yes, but do I have concerns as someone in the digital rights sector? I do have concerns. And also as a public policy practitioner, I wonder if then this is a good thing to have. And we are adopting a lot of service delivery solutions online, where we still continue to see long queues at different offices, yet we have thousands and thousands of services online. So what's the missing link? If we say then we're progressing in terms of digitizing our services, but then also from a policy and legal angle, I think another thing we've seen in the recent years is adoption of new laws and just relooking at existing ones. I think one that we are super proud of is the Data Protection Act 2019. Recently, a lot of us were also involved in giving feedback to the proposed AI strategy 2025-2030. So we are seeing a lot of proactivity in terms of ensuring that we have laws around digital governance. But then I still think we can do enough. I will talk about it a bit later. So I'll allow Caleb to weigh into spending things in governance.
Good. I will say two things just to expand on what has been said. The first thing is that we have seen a much wider array of participation, especially in Kenya. Online, we've seen Kenya's been given an option of submitting their views through emails and crashing the Senate server. And that shows how, especially the younger generation, Gen Zs, they are owning up this public participation. It's no longer a thing for a few people, but we are seeing more and more Kenyans participating in public participation, especially through submitting their views through emails. So that's the first thing. We have more channels of participation. The second thing we've seen, especially in the last 3 years, we nullified key policies which have gone against public participation. And a good example has been the Maisha number, Huduma number, which the court has been able to stop because there wasn't enough consideration of public participation. And what that has done is that public participation is now being taken as a more serious engagement. It's no longer that either PR exercise or checkbox, tick box kind of a thing, but we are seeing, especially from government agencies, they are taking public participation more seriously. The question of whether this public participation can be made to be more effective and more meaningful, we can talk about that later. But yes, we've made progress in terms of widening channels of participation, and we are seeing the seriousness, especially when the courts rulings are coming to say that yes, public participation is not just a suggestion; it's something embedded in the law.
Thank you, Caleb. Maybe just to, sorry, Timothy, to jump in now, but very interesting to hear what both of you are sharing so far. I think, Miriam, with what you expressed some concerns that you have with this sort of rampant digitization process that's happening. But also, I think it's interesting, Caleb, that that there is significantly more public participation in a sense, even when, of course, there could be more being done in terms of accessibility of how people could get to do that. But it's also interesting that you point that to the young people. Would you point that to how young people are able to, because they're the people who typically have access to a smartphone and the internet, and so they're the people who'd get on an email and respond to say a policy review or something.
Yes, for sure. But I think even further still, there seems to be a more concerted effort among this younger generation, not because they have smartphones or because they know how to send an email, But I guess with the finance bill, there was sort of an awakening of not only civil participation but political awareness. Before politics would be seen like a thing of older people, but like they said, if we don't do politics, politics is going to do us. So it seems to be like a very personal. It seems to be a very innate way of this younger generation to participate, even further than them just having smartphones and them having access to technology.
That is very interesting to note. Also, especially going into, we're now in a new year and seeing, what's happening in the landscape and just anticipating sort of what's going to come forward. I think that foregrounding sort of gives us an idea what may be happening if there is this growth of, just civic awareness and more people wanting to partake in it. I think I'll put to Timothy, I'll ask the next question because I think it ties into sort of what we've been talking about. Would you say that digital transformation is centering citizens' realities and needs as it is currently happening? And again, this is to sort of the conversation Miriam mentioned, sort of like we're going to digitize these many services, right? So would you say that the process is centering citizens' realities and needs currently? You're welcome, Timothy. Okay. As we wait for Timothy to get back, we could get this back to us. Mumbi, you could join us as well, and Irene for this chat. Beatrice and Caleb, what are your thoughts on the process as it is currently?
Yes, I can speak a lot about whether citizens' needs are being captured, and the report brings a very important conversation about coverage versus usage. And in Kenya, we've made such good progress when it comes to expansion of fiber, expansion of infrastructure, which is really great. But then I think the point we are, and the most important point, is on the usage. I work with children in rural areas, and children. When you work with children, by extension, you also work with parents. And one thing we've seen with the new education system, there's just a lot of need for not just digital skills, but access to digital infrastructure. But in rural areas, what we've noticed is in as much as there are local cyber cafes, a good number of parents do not know how to use those cafes. And what they end up doing is paying much more to pay other people to do what they can actually do. Why is that? It's because either perception of digital skills are not our thing. It's a thing for other people. Maybe communities where women are not allowed to go to the market or are not allowed to visit a certain places like cyber cafes. Only boys and men can enter these cyber cafes because they are seen as movie spaces, and women cannot be able to access those spaces. So we need to do a lot more in terms of talking about, yes, we might have access to phones and internet connections, but what is the level of usage? What are these underlying inequalities or barriers that tend to hinder very specific people? And in mind, I have like women in rural areas or girls in rural areas who, because of cultural, norms and practices, they're not allowed to either access this public digital services.
That's I think you help us paint a really good picture of that. And maybe I could now ask Miriam, to what Caleb has spoken about, what would you see as some of, where would you see instances of, this inclusion happening, right? Instances of bringing these groups that have been left out, right? Where do you see some opportunities for future inclusion from some of, what you're finding with your work or what you see around?
Thanks, Bobina. I really admire Caleb's optimism, a positive outlook towards these things. Yeah, I would say we have a long way to go, and I'm saying this appreciating the sort of urgency that we are seeing amongst young people. what Caleb is calling public participation. But I would say it is not, it's just conversations people are having, and how meaningful is this public participation? I think it can be more meaningful and more defined. And a great place to start would be to finally adopting a public participation bill. Since 2016, we've been saying we need systems and structures around how public participation is carried out in this country. So far, we've had how many? 5 or 6 drafts of the same bill by different entities, different individuals. And I think as OGP, actually, sometime last year, we made comments, robust comments to how public participation should be carried out to ensure that communities that are left behind more often than not in terms of policy processes, then they will be more included. I think that's a great, fantastic place to start, because it will ensure that when we are putting together laws or policies, then all voices are integrated into the process. So Caleb has mentioned rural communities, rural areas. There are also informal workers. We have women, people living with disability. I'll give a very specific example that we were speaking about in, this colleagues in this space, like the recent AI strategy, the draft AI strategy. We were only given, was it 4 business days for public participation, and even issues as basic as translating the document so that it's accessible to different people with disabilities. That was not factored at all, or explaining just the burden of explaining what the document speaks about and what it says to different entities, say in rural areas. That was not factored at all. So I say we have a long way to go in ensuring that different facets and different people, are integrated. And as a solution, I think just in ensuring that finally we have a public participation bill so that it guides how we are supposed to integrate these said communities. I think that would for sure would be my recommendation. Yep.
I wanted to just add to that, just based on what you said with like our research findings. A really critical feedback was the fact that we also really need to make public participation meaningful, because inclusion can't just be at the stage of including diverse voices, but actually what we run the risk of doing when we include people, but we don't actually have feedback loops to actually substantiate to people how their views have actually been included within the policy-making space, is that we risk people becoming apathetic. Because what does it mean to continue writing comments, bill after bill, especially when it comes to digital governance and how it relates to young people? What does it mean to keep writing comments and knowing at the end of the day that none of these comments, not only will these comments not be included within the policymaking stage, but also that these comments will not even be documented truthfully, where we really risk eroding this idea of public trust and even this more energetic approach to participating within politics if there isn't actual systems through this public participation bill that would actually demonstrate and create transparency around public participation. So, inclusivity is not just about diversifying who gets to participate. It's also about making sure that people can meaningfully shape the policy-making process.
I wanted to come in
quickly.
Okay, go Miriam.
All right. No, yeah. So it's about public participation, and just to highlight for colleagues who are not involved in the process, some of the recommendations we were giving have issues of apathy, which I absolutely agree, was to sort of curate a feedback mechanism so that comments that were given or recommendations that were given, then the citizens would be told that we were not able to adopt this because of 1, 2, 3 reasons. It violates a specific law, for example, or resources are not, whatever, so that you at least understand why your comments have not been adopted. And those that have been adopted, then there's a clear sort of, just to have that feedback mechanism. Because what we've seen in the recent times is that it's just ticking the box and saying, different committee in parliament, we consulted the public, but yet you'll find what has been adopted is the same version before you give comments. So that's one of the things that we were recommending. And then also time frame and timelines to issuing or giving comments. Like, you know, people are busy, and we've not had a specific law for 20 plus years, and there's a sort of rush to adopt it in a week. So we were suggesting at least 21 working days to ensure that every person is involved and to have sufficient time to go through whatever documents, particularly in the digital governance space. But then also looking at how tech savvy we are as a country, ensuring that we at least have an online portal for public participation, just looking at, you know, where we are as a country and issues around accessibility and usability, not as the only channel for public participation, but as one of the channels for public participation, just to get an array of thoughts. But unfortunately, that bill has still not been passed. I think as OGP Digital Cluster, it's something that we are really following, and we are really keen on it. And hopefully, a time like this next year, we'll say we fought hard, and now we have an act, a digital policy or a public participation act. But yeah, I just wanted to point out that those are some of the recommendations we're putting out.
In the interest of time, Bobina, allow me. I wanted to chip in on research and development, seeing as we've advanced, Kenya is always advancing in the digital and data governance sectors. I hope Timothy can hear me if you're still on the call, or any other Kenya government representative who may be on the call. The Africa Union has, or member states, agreed to at least 1% of the national budget going into research and development. And to this day, no country has met some of these pre-advancements to really support our innovation, to support our digitizing efforts and all that. So I was very curious, even as Kenya is advancing and over 10,000 government processes have been digitized, what are the research and development mechanisms, and how are they also engaging with communities? And in this, that's where the data ethnography comes in, as Mumbi, Bobina have shared in the findings, where the culture and communities voicing their concerns, voicing their interests, voicing their very keen note on, if you're building these government services, maybe think about 10 years to come, how our kids will use them, as Caleb has also highlighted. So with the question of research and development, I think it also will advance. If the Kenya government is advancing and digitizing the processes and services, do we or do Kenyans know who is building some of these tools, who owns some of the companies that build some of these tools, and who manages? Because at the end of the day, we know sometimes, let's give a short example of even our policy website. Sometimes it's down, sometimes it's closed, or sometimes it's, the management of it can sometimes fall through the cracks, and what happens in that regard. And this is very clear from the findings from the research and the study, that against the OGP principles, which we were all backdropping, that at the end of the day, governance is supposed to center ownership, so that everyone, or rather the citizens, can feel part and parcel of the process of ownership, and also management of some of these government or governance structures that are being digitized in Kenya. Thank you, Bobina. Sorry for taking an extra time.
No worries. Thank you very much for that contribution. I totally agree. I think broadly what's coming up is, that I think what we're hearing is that reforms are not enough, and that rather what we should have with the reforms is they should be linked to outcomes that are very clear in terms of what's in it for the citizenry, right? So a theory of change that is very clear, and I think that's sort of the research, what we've spoken to with like, all this dissonance we're seeing in the way things are understood from design to implementation, then now coming to the realities of how things are playing out today with the entire process of digitization and etc. And I think just in the interest of time, Timothy, I don't know if you're still with us, but we have been weighing in on just how the digital governance process has been happening over the last 3 years. Particularly with how we feel it has been centering citizens' realities If you're still on the call with us, we'd love to hear your thoughts, and then we can wrap up this roundtable discussion.
Yeah, thank you very much. Sorry, I was out of office. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear
Yes,
you.
I had some challenges, but I think I've tried to follow the very insightful discussion. And I think there are very many valid points being raised. Maybe to start, I would say that instead of just talking about digital governance, we should backpedal and talk about governance in itself. Because I think if we have proper governance, then we won't be thinking of inclusivity, we won't be talking about marginalization, we won't be talking about all these other issues. And I think that's where the dissonance comes, where the Ministry of ICT is supposed to take care of some things that I think one of the speakers there said there's a problem with the mandate. Who's supposed to ensure gender inclusivity? Who's supposed to ensure that all the marginalized people are taken care of? The way the government thinks, and it may not be correct, but we look at geographical reach. This country is divided into 290 wards, administrative wards. That's the small unit that is managed by an MCA. So like the ICT ministry is thinking of ensuring that there's fiber connectivity to each of these wards, and they're distributed around the country. So the assumption is that if this is done, then a good majority of the people will be covered, all right? And I think these are important questions being raised. From the perspective of the Ministry of ICT, I think what we need, first of all, is to have a critical mass of the citizens on these platforms. Then once you do that, then now we can come into the nitty-gritties. You'd also know that we are still a developing nation, so to speak. So some of the yardsticks that are being used to measure some of the programs we have may be a little bit hard to attain because of budgetary constraints, because of maybe our cultural background, all right? But it's good that these are coming out. And I'm sure, as we discussed during the last meeting that we had at the Radisson Blu, that when these are given to the policymakers, they'll now, in the next generation of our computerization, our automation, in the next generation of our infrastructure rollout, then we need to have these things embedded as we go along. Thank you. I think that's what I would say for now, unless there's a very specific question.
Thank you, Timothy. I don't know if any of the speakers has anything to comment or add to that. Miriam or Caleb or Mumbi or Irene.
I could add. I think a question that came up in our research, Timothy, is this question of rapid digitization, even as that critical mass hasn't been reached, or it hasn't been reached, and then also this idea of inclusivity hasn't actually been factored in. So what you have is services are only being able to be reached by being on these particular platforms. Yet even when people have access to fiber connectivity on the ground, they don't have the skills or the time or the literacy to be able to actually use those platforms in order to access the very life-saving services that would enable them to sort of live their lives in the way that government is envisioning. So for us, it's a question of how are both of these things being sort of pursued if inclusivity is being thought of as an afterthought, because what would be the point of increasing connectivity if at the end of the day your citizens can't even use those services that you've invested so many resources in expanding?
Yeah, I think that is a very valid point and a good question you're raising. I think they're usually different priorities, and sometimes maybe the government assumes that this will sort themselves out later. I think the priority for the rapid increase in the services that are now online was more of revenue raising or sealing leakages in revenue. And of course, as we do that, it means then that there are people who will be left behind. Maybe the assumption is that if people are able to use their phones, then they should also be able maybe to apply for some of these services. But it's true, I've been in some of these Huduma centers, and there's a lot of struggle. And that's why the idea of the Huduma Center came in for the initial, for service provision, especially for those who don't have computers, those who don't have the literacy. But I think this is a valid point you raise, especially if you want to move into a self-service kind of environment where we don't need help. So the training, the digital literacy is also an aspect that we will need to ramp up. It has been geared towards people in schools, maybe people in TVETs, but we need to look at the people who may be out of these institutions, but still need government services. So I think that is a point that is valid and is noted. Thank you.
Thank you, Timothy, and thank you to our speakers. In the interest of time, we're wrapping up this roundtable. Just to say again that I think this is very brief, but a good sort of just primer to anyone who's getting into the study, which is literally called Digitizing Kenya, an assessment of the citizen centricity of Kenya's digital governance. So I think this conversation gives you a bit of an overview of what we go over in the report, that these are the issues we're unpacking, is the digital governance process as it's happening currently. Speaking to citizens' realities and needs as it is, and how is inclusion understood. We've heard about prioritizing by government in terms of their strategic priorities, some things coming before the others. We've heard about how public participation is happening, and what could happen better. So thank you very much to our speakers for joining us. It's been a great pleasure conversating with you all. So we will now move into the last session of the last few minutes of this. Actually, we're coming close to the close. We'll have a short Q&A. So we'll take some questions. I already see some in the chat, but if you do want to, air out your question, please do put up your hand or feel free to unmute and let us know. Could be a comment, could be just some commentary. Do let us know your thoughts on this work so far. All right, I guess I'll go with the ones in the chat first. Alison, hi Alison, it's good to have you join us. Your question is, you'd love to hear what our top 1 to 2 wish list or recommendations are for partners to implement in the next year. What is the one thing that would make a big difference towards more inclusive digital governance in Kenya? Okay. Mumbi, is Mumbi here? Or Rachel's hand is up. Mumbi, do you want to take these? Or Irene?
Yeah, I mean, I could do one. I do think it was raised by Miriam in terms of this idea of creating feedback mechanisms when it comes to digital governance. I think it's a very simple thing that can be done by government actors when people participate, giving them an itemized list of the dominant sort of suggestions that came in, why they're not being incorporated, and also taking serious consideration of citizens' contributions. I think that's something that we even made as a recommendation within the toolkit. So actually there's a report in our toolkit, which will both be launched after this session. So yeah, that's one thing that came up. And I think the other thing is about collaborating and resource sharing around this idea of gender data and building capacity to actually collect gender data. I think there's a lot of organizations that have the capacity and have the technical expertise in order to shift our approach to it. But I think what happens, and it was mentioned within the research, is that there's a lot of fractured approaches that are being shaped by development funding, which means that a lot of people are doing the same thing, but what would it look like for us to combine resources and actually shift this approach using our, and create a shared and therefore a larger impact. I think that's another thing that needs to happen, because as Timothy was saying, there's funding constrictions that mean that even as we are demanding that gender data become a priority, it's not likely to happen within the near future. So what does it mean for us to take the step of combining resources and pushing this agenda ourselves? Because not one organization can do it by itself. A lot of us can do it together.
I totally agree. And maybe just to add to that, and just to the speakers who may not be aware, because some of the folk have not been with us, and actually I think most people, is that we have two resources coming out of this research. So there is this study, which is sort of investigating all these issues, then a toolkit, which sort of puts across best practices to go about this rethinking of digitization, which is sort of the call to action here with the study. How do we rethink this entire process? And we sort of give, step by step of how that process can be done. I hope that answers your question, Alison, what Mumbi put across. Okay, the other question is from Jay Shapiro, who is asking, who owns or oversees the digitization efforts of services and public interactions across government of Kenya? Is there one person who has the explicitly defined as their responsibility? Who has this explicitly defined as their responsibility? My understanding is that each agency department is responsible for their own efforts with assistance from ICT. But is there any one person measured by the success failure of these efforts? I feel like this has come up a little bit. Yes, please, Timothy, go ahead.
Yeah, I think that's correct. While individual agencies take responsibility, there is the Department of eCitizen that is supposed to run the platform. There's a whole directorate of eCitizen that does that. And then there's a Ministry of ICT that runs the underlying infrastructure. So the front end is done by the Department or Directorate of eCitizen, which actually falls under the Ministry of Interior. It's separate from ICT. Thank you.
Rachel, your hand is up. We'll take your question. You're welcome.
Thank you so much, Bobina, and congratulations to the entire team on this work. Bobina, at the very beginning, you had mentioned digital governments and also e-governments. I just wanted to know if there's a difference between those two, and if so, what would be the distinction or the difference in that? Thank you so much.
Yes, Rachel. I had explained earlier, and you'll find a bit more of that in the report, that from the literature, one is mostly a subset of the other. Digital government, which is basically integration of ICTs in how government, operates or deals with its different stakeholders, whether it's government to citizens or government to businesses, is a subset of the broader digital governance, which is it's a much broader landscape, which includes digital government itself, which includes citizen participation in influencing decision making, e-governance, and all these different aspects. So it's a much broader, and I think it's what we've been trying to speak to with the inclusive digital governance approach, which takes on this broader outlook on issues as opposed to just this technical aspect of integrate ICTs and that's it, but rather move to this much broader perspective, which encapsulates all these different other issues. I hope that answers your question. And there is, more of that, of course, I've broken it down so quickly, but in the report.
Thank you so much. Yes, very clear. Thank you. I'll read the full report.
All right, you're welcome. I don't think we have any other questions in the chat. If there are no other hands, because I don't see any, I would like to allow our speakers a final word, just a quick minute each, and then we will have Irene come in to wrap up.
Yeah, thank
Miriam.
you. I think maybe I can go first. I'll need to run. Yeah, thank you very much for this research and this presentation. I think there are a lot of things that fall through the cracks when you just look at the big picture, or when you just have the bird's eye view. And I think the next level is to look at the issues of inclusivity, both gender and the marginalized people in our content. I've picked up the issue of not assuming the digital literacy of the entire population. I think this is something that we'll really need to look at. For public participation, I think more needs to be done, as you have mentioned. It is a requirement. And as we said, maybe the budgets are not there, and the demands are a lot vis-a-vis the deadlines that we are dealing with. So sometimes we don't get quality public participation. But as we go along, and when the act comes into place, I think even now as we budget, we have to think about this. As you make policies, as you make laws, when you budget, you don't just budget for the technical people, you don't just budget for the, what you'll need to come up with a policy. The public participation engagement is also an element in those budgets. So I'm happy. Thank you very much for this.
Maybe I can go next to say that I think it's high time that where inclusion, it comes by design and not by chance. Because many a time, we are more concerned about the access, but then inclusion is only by chance. If they get bundles, or if they know how to use their phones, then they can access e-government services. But with the new framing, I think we need to push that narrative of access without inclusion by design is not the real access. And so we need more focus on making inclusion by design kind of approach.
Thank you for the invite and congratulations once again. And to also iterate that this mass onboarding of services online should be coupled with what we've been talking about, inclusivity, but a second layer is issues around security. If you recall, last year, the Communications Authority of Kenya said that there were about 860 million attempts to cyber attack attempts. So we also need to couple that. And the questions that are being asked here, if you integrate issues of security, then we won't be asking questions of who owns the platform. Is our data actually safe? So those two aspects need to be balanced when you're talking about digital governance. And please pass the public participation bill. It's about time. Pass the public participation bill, and all these issues of who is included in conversations and public policy making processes will be a thing of the past. Those two things. Thank you.
Irene, you're welcome. Thank you very much, Beatrice. Thank you, Caleb. Thank you, Timothy.
Mumbi, do you have anything?
No, I don't. I think I said what I had to say. But before you speak, Irene, it would be nice to have Harriet from OGP.
That's what I wanted to introduce. Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Harriet, yeah, sure. Harriet, I see you're here. Thank you for joining us, and thank you to the OGP staff who are also part of this launch. Thank you for supporting us to put out this very wonderful work, and for the coordination in Kenya with the OGP civil society members and OGP Kenya government representatives, which of course, always begets bureaucracy and other processes, but we've been able to put out this very needed study. Policy has had other work in Kenya before, but this really centers on some of the main pillars of the Kenya government, which is something that the citizenry is also following. So with that, then I will be welcoming Harriet Wachira from Open Government Partnership Secretariat, at least for the Africa office or the global office, to shed more light on how else we can engage as OGP as a government member, the Kenya government representation, and also civil society, and also individual contributions. And then after that wonderful closing remark, I will also be looking forward to closing so that we can go and read the report. Karibu sana, Harriet.
Thank you. Thank you, Irene. Can you hear me okay? Okay.
Yes, we hear you fine.
Yeah, so I came in at the tail end of the conversation. I'm sad I missed a majority of it, but I was able to get some really good insights. So first is to congratulate policy on the launch of this report. It is quite timely and it speaks to what OGP stands for, particularly here in Kenya, looking at some of the commitments that we have made under the National Action Plan. I'll start briefly just to talk about what OGP is, or about the OGP. So for those who are not aware, the Open Government Partnership was formed in the year 2011 by about 8 governments and several civil societies with a vision of having open governments working in partnership with civil society to strengthen democracy and have better societal outcomes. It's one of those platforms that brings together government, civil society, private sector to discuss a reform agenda on key thematic issues. Kenya joined the OGP in the year 2011, the same year it was formed. And what that means is that we have had national action plans. So the way the OGP works is once you join or you sign on to the OGP, you create that reform agenda, and this is done through a national action plan, which is simply, reform items that both government and civil society have co-created or have generated together to say, for this 2 or 3 years, these are the reform areas that we are going to work on. Kenya is currently on the 5th National Action Plan, and it has several commitments. One of the key is the digital governance, and on this, there is the objective to promote ethical, safe, inclusive, and responsible digital transformation, which speaks again to the study that you are launching today. It also has a commitment on public participation, legislative and fiscal openness. I had somebody talking about launching, enacting the public participation law. And if you look at that commitment, one of the key things there is to ensure that the public participation law in Kenya is enacted to underpin, citizen engagement in policy matters, particularly in policy matters. And there's also another commitment on access to information. Just to say that there are all these commitments or reform agendas co-crafted by civil society and government, to ensure that citizens participate in the governance and democracy processes in their country. So that's one of the key things about the OGP, that co-creation. Government cannot say this is what we want to reform, or civil society cannot say here is our reform agenda. We have to sit together and agree. And then one of the other key things about the OGP is the independent review mechanism. So government cannot blow their own horn and say, oh, we have achieved 1, 2, 3, or civil society say we have achieved 1, 2, 3. There has to be that external review mechanism. So, and there are reports that are published after each national action plan, just to show that the reforms, the extent to which reforms have been achieved as agreed earlier. So one of the ways that, is a key takeaway for this launch is to have, if there are any organizations represented here that are interested in, participating in the OGP process, I don't know if Irene had shared the National Action Plan. They can, or somebody can just drop a link on the chat. Yeah, you can just look at the thematic areas that the OGP platform in Kenya has proposed. And see, if you have that interest, we can introduce, I don't know if is Mzalendo on the call? Mzalendo Trust. Yeah, so the way OGP works is there's a point of contact, which is government. At the moment is the Ambassador Philip Sigo, the tech envoy. And then on the civil society side, there is Mzalendo Trust. And when you look at the National Action Plan, you'll be able to see contacts of the Zalendo Trust, and you can reach out and express interest to participate in the OGP process. And you'll be able to be onboarded into the cluster or the reform process that you'd wish, or the commitment that you'd wish, and you'll be onboarded, and you'll be able to participate there moving forward. And then there are also, just quickly, 6 counties that have also signed on to the OGP. We have Nairobi, Kakamega, Elgeyo Marakwet, I think Bungoma. They're listed in the National Action Plan. So please look, if you are operating in any of these counties, this is also an opportunity to go and look at because they also create individual national action plans. Go into, look out for that and see where you can plug in as a civil society, a partner on digital governance, particularly on, on digital governance at the national or the subnational level. With that, once again, Policy, Irene and your team, it is really great to see the launch of this report. It's been quite a bit of time coming, notwithstanding the challenges, and really congratulations, and we look forward to continued engagement and support from the OGP support unit. Asante.
I want to close quickly. Thank you very much, Harriet, for the wonderful overview of Open Government Partnership. We have shared the National Action Plan for Kenya, OGP, which is the 5th since it joined in 2011. And we have finally shared the link to the report. Please have a digest, take a look and read over the week and give us any questions you may have. If you have any media follow-up, we are also available, and you can email us at info@policy.org. We're also happy to contribute to this kind of research in other countries in Africa who are also OGP members or not, because we also understand there may be some hard lessons. So we thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you for sticking to the end and to this time of the day. Thank you to the OGP team. Thank you for the Secretariat's effort to this very end, even with what's happening in the US side of things. So with that, really, thank you again to Team Policy for putting in effort and for these reflections, even those who participated on the project and are not Kenyan, and you saw a lot of issues arising and you are able to overcome, even with the peaceful protest last year in Kenya. So again, to say we are available and we look forward to engaging with you all in this work. Kwaherini.